Well, 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 if it isn't the consequences of his own actions. In the third indictment in so many months, Donald Trump has been charged in connection with the plot to overturn the election results of 2020, leading up to the haphazard coup attempt during the January 6th riot. We can call it a riot, an insurrection, a coup. I'm using riot here because it is the most neutral term without leaning into the inaccuracy of calling it a protest. I go to protests all the time. This was not that. I'm not damning the event by calling it a riot either. I'm damning it because of its goal. I suspect many within his base knew this was bogus, but seized the opportunity to have their leader hold on to power. Many within his base, however, clearly swallowed the lie. On January 6, 2021, during the certification of the results, Trump delivered an angry, despotic speech, and a short while later, much as he anticipated and hoped, the worst of his base attempted to keep Trump in power. This was not some egalitarian revolution to create a better world or mass movement to overthrow a tyrant. This was a far-right attack to maintain right-wing power in the United States. Some people romanticize this event, calling them patriots and likening this to the American Revolution, but to paraphrase a great man, you absolutely do not have to hand it to them. I already knew most of the details, having followed the case and written videos on the subject, but reading the indictment has revealed how dangerous this could have become. A Trump ally in the Justice Department, Jeffrey Clark, was nearly elevated to greater power before threats of mass resignations changed that outcome. According to the indictment, an attorney told Clark that a coup would result in riots in the streets. Clark told the attorney that the Trump team's plan would be to weaponize the United States military against civilians through the Insurrection Act. As explained by Tim Dickinson of Rolling Stone, the Insurrection Act has also been criticized as too loosely written, with few guardrails such that Americans must rely on the restraint and good judgment of the Commander-in-Chief to ensure that the remarkable power won't be abused. The act has been used for high purposes. During the Reconstruction period, President Grant used it to go after the Ku Klux Klan. In the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower invoked it to help desegregate schools. Lyndon Johnson used it in the 1960s to help protect civil rights marchers in the Deep South. The last time it was invoked by George H.W. Bush was to help put down the 1992 uprising in Los Angeles, following the acquittal of the police who brutalized Rodney King. But the current indictment alleges that the Insurrection Act was considered as a means to use the power of the military, or perhaps even informal militias, to suppress the righteous outrage of American voters at the theft of an election, by the thief himself. Criminal conspiracies within the government do happen. This is one massive example, but Trump's supporters don't want to hear about the real conspiracy, they want to hear about the fake conspiracies. They want to hear conspiracy theories that reinforce their worldview and valorize their heroes. This is not a matter of conspiracies for me, not for thee. It's a matter of some things have evidence and some things don't, and spreading misinformation is always dangerous. I'll explain the thought process of the conspiracy theorist later. There is just so much to cover. There is a lot of misinformation about January 6th in the news and on the internet, and now seems like the perfect time to debunk some of it. If you have MAGA friends and relatives who go on and on about Antifa, link them to this video and see how it goes. For reasons that I will explain later, it probably won't change their mind, but at least their views will be challenged. The first conspiracy theory is that law enforcement staged the Capitol riot, or waved in protesters as part of an elaborate setup. This is false. Conspiracists use two pieces of information from the riot and twist those pieces of information into misinformation. Conspiracy theorists want the riot to be something created by the feds or the deep state, and they cite the presence of some off-duty police officers among the rioters as proof of this. However, this is not proof of a government conspiracy in and of itself, nor is it suspicious. Police officers are commonly among the ranks of the conservative movement in the United States. It's not that unusual that among thousands of rioters, there were a few people who made their living in law enforcement. The other piece of information skewed into misinformation is related to this video. It's a video purportedly showing police waving in rioters, but this video has been debunked by this other video from another angle. The officer was waving to another officer to tell that officer to fall back. It looks like he's waving people in because of what was happening in the moment. The rioters were pushing forward, but that's why the officer was signaling to the other officer. This has been fact-checked by multiple outlets. I'm not just taking a wild guess here. The next conspiracy theory is that anti-fascist organizers were behind the riot or responsible for the violence at the riot. This is also false. The social media accounts that began spreading this conspiracy theory were, not surprisingly, linked to QAnon. Some onlookers suspected that rioters dressed in all black were anti-fascist protesters, but that turned out to be false too. See, the Proud Boys chose not to wear their normal yellow and black uniforms and instead wore all black. The Proud Boys have been convicted of crimes that day. Big Bad Antifa has not. Doctored pictures or real pictures without context have also been presented as evidence of this conspiracy. For example, this picture shows a man with a tattoo, and the tattoo has been erroneously labeled as a communist hammer and sickle. Even if it were, that would not be evidence of a conspiracy, it's just one man's tattoo. But it's not even that. It's from a video game called Dishonored 2. Other early claims like catching Antifa with facial recognition software were instantly debunked, and the latent claims have produced no evidence for about 2.5 years. The far right made no secret about what they wanted out of January 6th. The right did not need help from Antifa to do it. Out of the thousands upon thousands of rioters, the only vaguely left-wing participant was John Sullivan, someone with whom left-wing groups generally don't associate because he is said to be untrustworthy. Sullivan is not an Antifa leader, he's an outcast. A lot of people were in Washington, D.C. that day that you wouldn't expect, like the guy who did the voice for Jimmy Pesto on Bob's Burgers, or the wife of professional wrestler Chris Jericho. But there have been virtually no surprise rioters on the far left. Hundreds of people have been charged and convicted in the riot, and nearly every single one of them were supporters of Donald Trump and right-wing causes. Right-wing conspiracy theorists want some or all of the crimes committed by rioters to be the fault of other entities. Anti-fascist protesters, local law enforcement, the FBI, etc., because the truth is that people within their political ideology were the rioters. The right likes to talk out of both sides of their mouth on this one because they will simultaneously claim that this was a state plot or Antifa plot, all the while claiming that this was the work of patriots. They want to create two mutually exclusive representations of what happened to cause confusion. They try to reconcile this by saying that the patriots were there, but they were in some way manipulated by the machinations of George Soros or Joe Biden, and for that reason they were just not responsible. Yeah, okay. Before we tackle a couple more conspiracy theories, let's pause here and ask ourselves something. Why do people believe this, even years after the debunking? Why will some people still believe this even after watching this video? It comes from a few common logical fallacies and mistakes in reasoning. A common denominator in believing misinformation is called motivated reasoning or motivational bias. Motivated reasoning is a biased response in which people, whether consciously or not, allow the beliefs, political ideology, personal values, or emotions to either accept information that is not true but fits into their pre-existing beliefs, or to reject information that is true but does not fit into their pre-existing beliefs. Let's be blunt here. We all do this. We don't necessarily mean to, but we all end up doing this all the time. None of us are objective robots, and we all have opinions. The difference between everyday motivated reasoning and conspiracy-laden motivated reasoning is a matter of intensity, obsession, and perhaps degrees of gullibility. We're all guilty of this, but many of us are able to say, wait a minute, I despise this particular politician and everything they stand for, but this specific accusation does not pass the smell test and can be debunked. Remember this for later in the video and see if you can catch yourself wanting to believe the unbelievable. See if you can detect why you don't want to accept the debunking. Sometimes it's hard not to do it because of the discomfort of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological stress of holding two opposing views or facts. Dissonance can be resolved by acknowledging and resolving the dissonance, or the simpler solution, refusing to acknowledge the dissonance and engaging with a biased view of the facts. We feel less psychological stress when we do either, but the latter is quicker and easier. When we do the latter, we are using motivated reasoning. A similar but distinct bias related to this is called confirmation bias. The main difference between confirmation bias and motivational bias is action. When we see information that suits our worldview or makes sense to us, we unconsciously accept it as fact. That is confirmation bias. When we feel a cognitive dissonance and actively resolve it by making the clearly wrong choice, that is motivational bias, two sides of the same coin, all related. The worst conspiracy theorists see an event, make a claim about who could have benefited from the event, but provides no real evidence that could ever stand up in trial. For example, there are dozens of John F. Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories with dozens of hypothetical perpetrators because many people could benefit from such a shift in power. Lyndon Johnson is often cited by conspiracy theorists without much in the way of evidence, solely because he assumed the presidency following the assassination. He benefited from the event, but there is no real hard evidence between accusation and motivation. There is nothing in the middle. It's like a sandwich that's all bread and no meat. But the accusation is so strong and the motivation makes enough sense that people invested in it being true will just believe it. Conspiracy theories have been popping up more and more lately due to the proliferation of social media and bad actors with enormous power. This new conspiracism is what experts like Nancy L. Rosenblum and Russell Muirhead call conspiracies without the theory. As explained in their book, a lot of people are saying, not only does the new conspiracism fail to offer explanations, there is often nothing to explain. Consider again the classic conspiracy theory that the US government helped plan and execute the 9/11 attack. However inaccurate, it helps explain the seemingly incredible fact that 19 individuals unaffiliated with any state could successfully destroy the World Trade Center and attack the Pentagon. In contrast, the new conspiracism sometimes seems to arise out of thin air, as with the claim that Hillary Clinton and her campaign chairman John Podesta ran a child molestation operation from the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., the Pizzagate conspiracy. The new conspiracists posit odious designs but not the how or why, and often not even the who. They do not marshal evidence, however implausible. There is no documentation of a long train of abuses, all tending the same way. I fully recognize that debunking misinformation will not yield a complete reversal by everyone who sees it, because people become too invested in their falsehood. When I made a video debunking the Nancy Pelosi husband conspiracy theory, people sent me so many comments refusing to face reality. When the police video was made public, further disproving the theory, those who initially believed it still hung on. Previously, they demanded the release of the video, even though law enforcement keeping evidence of an ongoing investigation from the media is standard operating procedure, for better or worse. But once the video was released, the conspiracists moved the goalposts and essentially said, "Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?" My politics, perhaps, create a bias in my mind against the modern centralized police, a suspicion of police activities. But I am not uncomfortable simply stating, in this instance, the police were simply telling the truth. I can reconcile that in my mind because I don't want to become a wacky conspiracy theorist. Despite my feelings about the police, I also don't think they were behind January 6th. I demand evidence. Conspiracy theorists do not. Debunking a conspiracy theory, even one without any real evidence, can still be extremely challenging because no matter how rock solid your evidence, when threatened, the human brain goes into this kind of survival mode and desperately searches for a reason to dismiss the evidence, because the only alternative is to admit they were wrong, and that can be terribly uncomfortable. It's why cognitive dissonance resolves itself with what's easier. What kind of information also matters. Convincing someone that something they heard as a child is a myth can be easy enough, but convincing that same person that something connected to their values or sense of self is wrong is met with more resistance. Information related to politics can also relate to that individual's personal values, culture, and even religion. Conspiracy theorists reach for anything. Oh, Snopes fact-checked this? Well, I don't trust Snopes because of this reason. Oh, the Associated Press fact-checked this too? Well, I don't trust the AP for some other reason. Oh, USA Today, PolitiFact, and Fox News all fact-checked this, huh? Well, I think they're all working together all of the sudden. If everything can be dismissed, then facts don't matter. Okay, let's return to our January 6th conspiracy theories. The next conspiracy theory is that then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi used her authority to block the National Guard from protecting the Capitol. Again, this is false. For one thing, we have video evidence of Pelosi calling for military assistance, including the National Guard, during the riot. For another thing, she simply does not have the unilateral authority to block the National Guard. Here's how it actually works. The decision to call the National Guard is made by the Capitol Police Board, which includes the House Sergeant of Arms, Senate Sergeant of Arms, and a federal agency called the Architect of the Capitol, which is responsible for maintenance and operation of the Capitol complex. The board did not call the National Guard before the riot, but did request assistance after the riot had begun. Nancy Pelosi has no authority to block the National Guard. She is functionally incapable of doing that. This has been fact-checked by numerous outlets. I'm not just speculating here. Maybe the Capitol Board should have anticipated the riot and sent the National Guard ahead of time, but it wasn't because of Nancy Pelosi secretly engineering this outcome. Now that I think of it, I don't recall many or any Republican politicians making public statements about wanting the National Guard to defend the Capitol that day either. Even if she did have the authority, which she absolutely does not, there has been no evidence whatsoever that has been brought forth that proves Pelosi secretly maneuvered to block the National Guard. None whatsoever. Considering the endless committee meetings and investigations into the matter, which included representatives of the Republican Party, we can reasonably conclude that this is almost certainly some make-believe conspiracy theory. The fact that it has been repeated by Republican conspiracy theorists in Congress does not make it true. It's missing the middle piece, the evidence. The next conspiracy theory is that the rioters were only protesters and had no violent intentions and no interest in blocking the election certification. Conspiracy theorists claim that this was a protest and that somehow the Democrats and the so-called liberal media have worked together to create a narrative about a harmless protest. This is false. Those who defend the rioters often claim that it was peaceful and that no weapons were found. In reality, many have been charged with possessing weapons during the riot, or for statements of intent to commit violence prior to the riot or during the riot. People chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," and searched for specific targets like Nancy Pelosi and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This was not a party or a protest. This was an incident designed to object to the correct results of an election through force. Members of far-right groups like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers have been convicted of crimes related to this plot. I'm not saying I always trust prosecutors or law enforcement, because if you watch this channel, you know that's not true, but certifiable evidence has been presented, and I'm able to look through my own bias about the police and the state and see that it's true. A lot of these guys had weapons, and a lot of these guys wanted to commit violence. It's just what happened. Let's be clear about something. Violence and even revolution can be justified by the injustice of what precipitated it. But this violence was spurred on by baseless, erroneous statements made by then-President Donald Trump, not injustice. This was also not a people's revolution. It was started by the commander-in-chief, for one thing, but it was also attended almost entirely by the right wing. More specifically, it was made up of mostly middle-class conservatives who traveled to Washington, D.C., and far-right groups like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, as well as actual neo-Nazi groups. Most of the world's ills are done out in the open. We don't like to think about it, but I think that's true. Capitalism, the world economic system, is responsible for many of these ills, but due to the power of propaganda, people accept these ills as either the cost of doing business or as a net good. This is also true of Western imperialism and atrocities committed superficially in the name of freedom and democracy. Capitalism and imperialism are not secret societies or secret systems. They don't have to be when those with authority have the power to tell you that the bad thing that you are seeing on the news is actually good. There doesn't have to be an Illuminati that secretly has too much power in the United States when the actual United States president already has too much power and he's elected in public. The Illuminati does not create capitalism and imperialism. They're just things that happen in public. There doesn't have to be an eyes-wide-shut billionaire party where they plot to maintain their wealth through sinister mind control when capitalism functioning as it's intended already creates that particular scheme out in the open. It's just boring, heartless economics. It's just money and power, a dull, banal system of wrongs. And that sucks because systems are harder to fight than some mysterious cabal. There is no puppet master behind it all. just massive institutions and nation-states, and some are more harmful than others. Real conspiracies do happen. For example, the former President of the United States was just charged with conspiracy. Conspiracists use the existence of actual criminal conspiracies within the government as evidence of the existence of their pet theory. But that is just not how evidence works. Evidence of a real government conspiracy is not evidence of an unrelated theory when the only common denominator is the permanent polity of the state. Your thing needs evidence too, or else it's nothing. All these conspiracy theories are false, but you can now see how they come about. Conservatives want some other ideology, some other party to be responsible. The accusation is made, the motivation is given, no real evidence is presented, but the bias that exists within all of us ignores the middle. Their brains tell them 2 out of 3 ain't bad. But in truth, without the evidence, the other 2 things are almost completely meaningless. Without evidence, you don't have 2 out of 3. You have 0. I hope that this will be the last time I have to explain all of this, because I've had to explain and re-explain the concept of conspiracy theories about once a year ever since Trump took office, and in the years following his administration, the aftermath of this explosion of misinformation. And now for the M. Night Shyamalan twist. Among all the easily disproved conspiracy theories surrounding January 6th, one of the worst does not come from the right wing. The wild theory that the Capitol bomber was actually a sitting Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene. I have seen all the videos and all the so-called evidence, and it is no more likely than any of the other January 6th theories. Sorry. This used to be something I would encounter from time to time on the bottom rung of Democrat Twitter and ridiculous body language expert videos, but now that it's being repeated by well-known people, it looks like someone needs to take this on. And why not me? I despise Marjorie Taylor Greene and everything she stands for, but even I don't think that she's the Capitol bomber because the evidence is just not very good. I recognize that this particular theory will also still be believed by those who have invested too much of their time to it and have leaned the wrong way in their cognitive dissonance. What about the fact that she wears an extremely common shoe? They will cry. Challenging this will be difficult, but I am up to the task. That video is coming next time. Stay tuned.